how important it is for all of us to do that. So I'm going to go through a little bit of information today, which I hope you'll find interesting and thought-provoking. And at the end of it, if you want to pass any questions back, then hopefully we can help you with that one. So sit back and welcome to my virtual forest. And this is where I am based. It's based at home, but my work at the moment is involved with projects, including one called the Ancients of the Future, and another one is Foresters Forest, which is based around the Forest of Dean. And why am I speaking to you today? It's because I've been involved with the countryside for over 50 years now. I've been working and managing landscapes, and it means that I've been able to look and see the changes that have gone on over that time. And many of them are now cause for great concern. So these projects that I'm involved with are trying to restore and regenerate and try to understand better what nature needs. So I've been outside walking around landscapes, managing countryside, and I've seen enormous change in that time. And it's something which I think now we've become aware of, that we can't really continue to do the way we've been doing it in the past. And we're learning a lot from historical information, but also by day-to-day observations. And you just go look around you today and you'll see how much our landscape has changed. It's become intensively exploited for the use for food production, for building, and for timber. And we've seen nature suffer from it all. We've seen the separation of nature and the landscape, lack of joined-up thinking. We've had removing space for nature, where trees like the one behind me can't actually grow very well. Then you've got landscape fragmentation. Being rather tidy has always been one of those things which is a great thing to do when you look after a piece of land, but there's a place where a bit of chaos is absolutely vital, where nature needs to operate. And we've really got to get back to allowing the natural processes to occur over a period of time. And then the continuing pressure we have in this very small country from HS2, housing, road building, agriculture. Many of these things have become unsustainable. And of course, the cause of soil and degradation and effect of water and pollution on our river systems is a key factor that we are all very aware of. So what is fragmentation? Well, we have divided and split up our landscape over the last 50 years to 100 years. In some situation, it probably isn't a big problem, but when you put a motorway through the middle of a landscape, this is one I was brought up in, and I watched this M5 be built. It is completely divided two pieces of woodland, and it separated out grasslands that were in between the woodlands. It's introduced tarmac and lighting into an area where wildlife was able to thrive very easily. And of course, it introduces noise, and then concrete lines are put through the centre, which stops animals moving freely across it. So fragmentation has increased across the whole country, and as long as we keep doing it, then nature will continue to decline. I mean, you do just think of an animal like the crane fly. This is one that lives in ancient trees, very old trusty things, a bit like the one I've got behind me. And this is one of many species, but it requires very special conditions. And that is old trees with decaying wood inside. They like dark, damp cavities, so it can produce its larvae, which it then starts breaking down bits of wood. So it helps as a detritivore, an animal which actually eats dead material. But when it comes out of its tree for a couple of months before it dies, it has to look for other trees of a similar size and type in order to produce more offspring. But there aren't any of those around. They're surrounded by conifers, by very dense woodland. Though there's very little light in these places, this is one that's been thinned and it's still very dense, but it's not a place where the crane fly wants to be. And then we've got the butterflies. All of those, or most of them, are now in decline as well, sadly. And they haven't got the food. They can't find the nectar sources where or places that they can lay their eggs on. So they're again suffering from the lack of habitat, and they can't fly hundreds of miles, unless it's a painted lady perhaps, but most of these butterflies need a continuous area of habitat. However, when it goes outside of its favoured bramble bush, it will find a desert of wheat. Now, we all need food, that's all important, but we've got to allow space for that natural process to continue, for those insects to be able to survive within this type of landscape. And that's why we've got to try to get a balance back, producing good, healthy, quality food, but also a healthy habitat. Because if the habitat is healthy, then we're going to be healthy with it. The change that goes on in our landscape today is phenomenal. You'll see literally tens of tractors busily working in the fields all at the same time. There'll be deep ploughing, there'll be cultivating the soil, there'll be ploughing right up to hedgerows and changing that landscape almost overnight. So it's all a very efficient way of farming, and that's to be applauded. But there are times when, and in some places, that type of farming might be inappropriate, and that's where we need to try to reintroduce the natural processes. Again, this is by the River Wye, and you can see the active impact it could have with flooding and with erosion. So the hedges are being removed, and again, the fields are becoming larger, and that's not a hospitable place for wildlife to live. And even with woodlands that are being put in across the landscape, we plant lots of trees, which is a fine thing to do. But when they grow very, very thickly together, all of the same species, they almost become impermeable. And this means that wildlife, bats, insects, birds even, find it difficult to actually find their way through them. And they sometimes find them pretty moribund when it comes down to food sources. Here there's no nectar sourcing available, so the trees just grow, and they all fight with each other, and they try to compete for light, and they finish up probably falling over or being cut down after about 20 or 30 years. And of course, we have to control nature, apparently. We seem to fight nature all the time. And with all the machinery and equipment we've got, it seems that it's a necessity for us to keep cutting our hedges, keep cutting the verges over and over again, using diesel, polluting the air with carbon. But there's no need for it in many places. There are places where we could allow nature just to thrive much more happily. And we could reduce maybe the costs on the farm in doing a lot of this work. The Plant Life, the organisation I work for, has a verge campaign. And we're very keen to see wildflowers come back across the landscape along the road verges. And so far it's been quite successful, but there's a lot more to do. And our meadows are disappearing. We've lost 90% of our lowland meadows in the last 50 to 60 years. They've been intensively managed, they've been cut, they've been improved and ploughed up. And we also lost many of our ancient semi-natural woodlands. And this is where wildlife has to be given place to survive. It's not just the insects, it's not just the flowers, it's all the microorganisms, the things that are in the soil, the fungi, and all the processes of the ecosystem that operates effectively if it's allowed to. But it's got to be done in a way that enables the natural world to survive within and around the human race. If you look at old maps, which I do a lot of, Ordnance Survey maps produce very interesting ones in 1860 to 1900. And in those days, they recorded very accurately the vegetation, the trees that grew across the landscape. Now, this goes to show just how many trees there were, the trees that were out in fields and the hedgerows, and many of those trees were actually in the hedgerows. We've lost many of them because of Dutch elm disease, but there is potential, I'm sure, to bring them back in the future. So by learning from the history, we can start to regenerate and reconnect our landscape together. And by looking at those corridors and those connections and the places that have been lost, the ponds that have been filled in, those old woodlands that have been thinned and reduced down, those are places where restoration is quite possible, and it also offers new opportunities to link it together more, and nature will start functioning again. It needs components. These are the components that, even if it's an engine, all the components have to be there for it to work or for it not to break down. So consider it in the same way. Take the components away from the natural world, no matter what they are, they all start making the natural world less resilient. The soil can be damaged, the fungi will disappear, the microorganisms in the soil can damage, and from the bottom up, everything else starts suffering. We lose the trees in the fields and the dead and the decaying wood because we want to tie it away. And the result is an impoverished, declining landscape where nature has been squeezed into little narrow strips in between large fields. No trees are allowed to grow in the hedges. And we finish up with large numbers of populations collapsing as soon as they start having a serious weather event or other situations arise. We've also been defining our landscape very dramatically with hedgerows, with fences. We've been making them very, very straight edges. We've been tidying up the corners and making sure that we can try to get into those fields as much as possible and basically remove the natural vegetation. And that has created a defined landscape which is not sympathetic to the natural world. And a lot of this has come about by a disconnected thinking. Although the world works in one system, it's an ecosystem, one thing dependent on another, we've separated it out. We've done agriculture in one box and we've done forestry in another box, and then we put nature in the corner because it's convenient and it's in the right place and out of the way. Well, that again doesn't really stand up. And the State of Nature reports, which we've been seeing being produced over the last few years, has confirmed that much of our nature is still in decline, despite all our efforts to try to conserve it and enhance it. So science is telling us things haven't worked, and I've been spending many, many years walking around the fields, working in them, trying to enhance landscapes, conserving areas, but we've got to do it in a different way. And we've just really understood, probably more in the last couple of months, how important it is for all of us to connect with nature, to reconnect with it if we've lost that connection before. And we're losing our connection because we live in cities. We have a very busy life. We don't have a chance to stop, sit and listen or look. And therefore, nature has become almost irrelevant to us until recently. Now we realise, because of the pandemic, it's absolutely vital that we're outside, we're enjoying the fresh air, we're seeing the birds and the butterflies, and we're enjoying the wildflowers. So this is what we've got to try to sustain, support, and enhance. And people love to go out in the countryside. We love to walk around, we love to see the old trees, we love to join up with families and enjoy fresh air and have picnics. But it is all at our peril if we continue to see it eroded and degraded. So restoring that resilience can only come about by stability over a long time. A tree doesn't work in our time of 80 to 90 years, it works in tree time, which is probably 400 to 500, maybe 600 years. A very, very slow process, very slow to adapt to change. But if that change does occur, it can react very, very slowly. So if we have a drought, the tree might die 10 to 20 years later. Or if the ground gets ploughed or compacted, the tree branches will probably start falling off and dying back 10 or 15 years afterwards. So it's a very slow process. So stability around these old trees is key. And I'm working with ancient trees every day, and it just goes to show how rich they are in wildlife when you stand around and look at what is living in and around them. They're vital. And they are testament to the changes around them, and they can tell us a lot more, if they could speak, about how we need to look after our landscape a little bit more sensitively. It needs to be joined up. We can have the stepping stones across the countryside with trees. They can be open grown in more open spaces rather than growing like lollipops in plantations. And we've got to work with nature rather than against nature. We understand now that the natural world is a pretty complex system, and one thing is reliant on another. We cannot push it too hard and too fast. So we're learning much more of the importance of trying to put the natural world to our favour by using animals to graze the open landscapes, not to use lawnmowers and spend lots of money cutting them back, but having animals actually grazing them in the way they would normally or they would have done in the past. So rather than shutting them out of our woodlands, I don't see why we really couldn't allow some of our livestock to be grazing within the woodlands. They get a lot of nutrients from the leaves and the brambles, probably more so than they got from grass. So there's a place for this mixed, holistic approach. Now, we might think this is a type of management which does include nature with the way that we manage and use land. And it's a more relaxed approach. It still produces food, but it also is a place where nature can survive without being affected by pesticides or regular removal of vegetation. And the trees will naturally grow, given the right amount of, or the correct sort of balance of management. We don't have to plant them. They will very often grow where they come through the brambles. And we'll see space for trees like this one, like the one behind me. It's a 300-year-old beech tree. And it's happily growing the way it wants to grow. It's not a tall, thin lollipop with branches all at the top. It's got enormous roots supporting it and low branches. And these are the type of trees which we'll expect can survive for 300, 400, 500 years. But if you look in your countryside today, I'm afraid you won't see very many of them. So this is the sort of tree which we've really got to encourage to grow more. And then as a tree becomes older, then we start seeing that ecosystem establishing itself. It takes a long, long time. It waits for a fungus to get into the tree to start with, which doesn't kill the tree all the time. It will probably eat out the middle of the tree, create a cavity, and then it will be followed by many of the insects. And the lichen will grow on the surface of the bark. Again, that needs to have a tree about 400 years old. So these things don't suddenly happen. It's a slow process, but continuity is the only way these wide range of biodiverse species can survive, and many of them rely on each other. That little pool in front of you, this is just a little cavity in a tree where you get some very rare hoverflies relying on a place for them to lay their eggs. And they live in that water for a while, and they will come out and then fly off to find a mate. So all of these species require dead wood. Take those away from the countryside, and these species are not going to be there. So I would like to suggest that we do allow trees to fall over, we allow them to decay naturally, and that we allow them just to break down back into the soil over a period of time. So we do need to give that space for wildlife to appear, to be able to thrive. And these are the places where they start. Without this dead wood, without the decaying wood, you won't have the bird life and all the other things that follow. How do we do all of this? It sounds like it's a big, tall order, perhaps. Well, I would suggest that restoration and regeneration is not a mission impossible. It's something that we can achieve. We've seen it happen already in quite a few areas around the countryside, where we step back and we've allowed nature to do what it wants to do, given the right conditions. This is an example of what used to be a coniferous woodland, a very dark woodland up on the Blackdown Hills. And by removal of those conifers and then introduction of some longhorn cattle, the plants reappeared from what was a very, very barren understory. So we got large numbers of species growing here, quite happily thriving, while the animals happily graze and get a lot of goodness from it. So nature will do a lot of that work for us. Our land improvement that we have been doing in contrast has been seeing an increasing decline in the ecosystems and even the soils that we have to look after so well. If we don't have soil, we don't have food. And we're losing that soil because of erosion, because of intensive management. And this is just an example in one particular part of Herefordshire, where you can see soil literally being washed down the hill into the drains, blocking them up, and then filling the River Wye. So we've got to move away from what is basically a very unsustainable way of managing our landscape. It's what I would suggest is abuse of our natural environment. And we talk about looking after the rainforests, and yet we've got to look after all the things we've got on our own doorstep much better. We've been planting lots of trees, which is a very good thing, but the tree in the right place, and it's the right tree. If you keep planting lots of trees close together, they will very often get very thin, they very often get diseases, they will not let light in, and that's because we planted them very close together and very often in rows. Conversely, on the right-hand side, if you allow natural regeneration, the tree very often is healthier. It might even be fed by nearby trees. And this is why existing woodlands need to be allowed to expand naturally, because they will have all those components which give the tree a good, healthy start to life. And natural regeneration has been shown that during the storms that we had in 1987, The trees that did better were the ones that naturally regenerated, and in fact not the ones that were planted. So we needed to, look about how we manage our woodlands, how we restore our woodlands. And the other element is to try to make an edgescape, more of a transition between a woodland and scrub into grassland and into crops. It's something which we do need to work very much more cleverly at. It's obviously something where there could be conflicts because of different land use. But if you go to middle of France, you'll see a lot of this type of transitional landscape. They don't have these rich strips of hedges or fences in the same way. You have ponds, you'll have water sources all over the place, and you'll also see lots of scrub. And in that scrub on the right-hand side is a place where nightingales would be singing. So that's what the environment that we should be looking towards to try to restore. And corridors and mosaics are probably the way that is going to help nature, so that those corridors link together places where larger pieces of nature can be able to thrive, where the scrub and the vegetation is diverse, and you'll have animals moving through the landscape with the dead wood and decaying timber and the fungi all doing their job of looking after and restoring a natural environment. The food will then become available for all the insects, and by not cutting things like the hedges so often, will allow hawthorn trees to grow. People don't realise perhaps that by cutting hawthorn early in the year, you stop the flowers from appearing, and the flowers are a very, very important nectar source for many, many insects. And without those, then these insects have no food source at that crucial time of the year in May. Then you get the umbellifers, the hedge parsleys, following on later in the year, which are again another source of very important nectar. But we do have to allow it to grow. And this is why the road verges and the hedges are such an important part of that element. Now, I do know this part of the world fairly well, and I've been looking at the old maps, and it tells me a little bit that there is potential, in my opinion, for a very large piece of landscape to be reconnected between the Malvern Hills and the Forest of Dean. Those are two important nature areas already, but by extending it into more of an open landscape, a mixed landscape, and areas that haven't been irreparably damaged, it's an area where you will still find orchards, you'll still find ancient trees, permanent grassland is quite widespread, and it's an area which I think could be restored over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I don't really think it's going to cost vast amounts of money to do it. It's just a matter of sharing a vision with everyone and then working together to achieve what we know is the best thing to do for nature. And in turn, it'll be best for us in the long term. And if you don't think what I'm talking about makes much sense, then I suggest you could look at things like the Lawson report about bigger, better and joined up landscapes, the Biodiversity 2020 to try to prevent further species in our landscape being lost, the biodiversity action plans that were produced some years ago, nature improvement areas. Green capital is now seen to be a value attached to nature, so it could well be that by looking after our landscape, landowners will actually get money for doing that rather than by producing lots of food, cheap food, maybe out of season food, things that we know aren't necessarily the long-term interest for us all. And ecosystem services are going to really come back into their own if we want to protect our landscape from the intensive weather systems that we are suffering from on a regular basis. We can't keep watching the flooding coming off the hills, running down the hills, so we've got to rebuild nature to look after the soil for us. So a bit of food for thought. If you were a sheep, where would you prefer to live? Would it be in a barren, muddy field, windswept, with plastic fields surrounding you? Or would it be in a pasture woodland, with old trees, with permanent grassland, lots of food available and shelter? I think I would go for the pasture woodland. So that pretty well sort of goes through what I wanted to talk to you about today. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul, for a fantastic talk. Hello, everyone at home. It's William here again from Helen's Garden Festival. Plenty of information for us to take away there, Paul. And And we've had a couple of questions in. One here from Lisa in Ledbury. She says this. She says, I have a standard size garden that backs onto a residential road. How can I plant trees in my garden in a way that best serves the nature and the landscape?
Okay, so I think a trees does have to be thought very carefully before you start planting in a confined space. They might be small when you buy them in the nursery, but as you can see from the one behind me, they get pretty big. So it's got to be the right tree. Now you could actually go for a tree like a rowan tree, which is quite a small one. It's a native tree, doesn't get very large, or a crabapple tree. It's a lovely one because it produces lots of food for insects and you get some fruits at the end of the year. They're trees which you can get on small rootstocks, so they don't ever get very, very large, probably 8 or 9 feet. So that might be something you want to consider. I've actually got a number of trees growing in pots, so I can move them if they happen to become a nuisance. So it's the ways of doing that. And the other thing you might want to think about, it sounds a bit strange, is if you can get hold of a big old log, a dead log, stand it up, stick it in the ground, and see what starts living in the log. If it's an oak tree, an oak log or something like that, or an ash log, those are the things which will attract those insects.
Fascinating. A really innovative way of changing your garden there. Our last question, Paul, comes from Greg in Gloucester. His is quite a simple one. He asks, isn't it down to the government to make the sorts of changes that you refer to in the talk?
Well, government has a very important role to play, and it's produced a paper, a policy called the 25-year Environment Plan, which is to be applauded. It does talk about a lot of the things which I've talked about today, but it does need people to work together. The government can suggest, encourage, but it's got to have the political or the public will to work with them to actually achieve these things. And there's no doubt that the general emphasis towards the funding that comes to the environment is moving away from food production and more towards landscape enhancement and restoration. So I think they are playing a role. They can obviously always do better, but in this current state of crisis, I don't think we can expect too much coming from money. But as I said a bit earlier, if you let nature do what she wants to do, you might not have to spend lots of money on doing it.
Fascinating. We've actually had a couple of extra questions. Is it okay if I ask them to you, Paul?
Yeah.
Great.
Sure.
So from John in Long Hope, he asks about forest gardening. Can we grow food and also connect the landscape?
Yes. Well, that's very much a new thing, which is becoming much more. More people are becoming more aware of it now. There's a gentleman called Michael Crawford down in Totnes, and he has a woodland garden. He runs courses, and he does show that he can actually produce large amount of food. And it's a thing called agriculture, agroforestry, mixing trees with the production of food from the ground level. So you're using different levels, different tiers. It's certainly well worth looking into because there is enormous potential. Even if you've got a very small plot, you can start growing lots of different species of fruit within that space and nuts. And our climate actually is looking quite promising towards maybe able to produce more of them.
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. And a last question, actually going back a little bit onto the political path, hope you don't mind. This from David in Malvern. He says, how do we persuade our politicians of the need to make the changes that we need to make? What are your persuasion tactics?
Well, I think, again, it comes back to public opinion, and it doesn't do any harm at all just dropping them maybe the odd email to say you're very concerned about your environment and like to see them spending more time finding out about it and coming up with solutions. A lot of people who are working in my sector, and the NGOs, non-government organisations, are able to talk to many of these, the politics and the different departments, and there's no doubt that they are more of a listening ear than they used to be, and they are starting to realise that bad environment management costs lots of money. So that is a very important driver when it gets politicians to sit up and listen. I think it's public awareness. It's getting people to really take this thing very seriously, and we hope that with this, the upside, if nothing else, from this wretched pandemic, people are going to realise that they've got to look after their green open spaces. So talk to the parish councils and get them to realise not necessary to be so willing to allow it to be developed on.
Yes, we were saying that, weren't we, just before we went live, that this whole pandemic may already has started to change how people are perceiving their landscapes and the importance of it.
Yeah, it is actually crucial that all of us will benefit if we see that approach rather than just thinking another piece of field can be lost.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again, Paul, for a fascinating talk and for being with us this afternoon. For everyone at home, please stay tuned. We've got our next event starting at 2 o'clock, I believe. And just a quick reminder that you can continue to donate to our beneficiaries via our Just Giving page. That's at justgiving.com/crowdfunding/HGF. But for now, thanks to Paul.
Thank you. Bye-bye.